Well, welcome to everyone. Lucy, we're delighted that you're here. Sebastian, Karen, Simon, Evie, and we'll get a chance to get to meet everyone a little bit more shortly. But thank you for being part of this. This is an important topic, and welcome.
Thank you.
Well, why don't we start with Simon, just to set this up a little bit. You've had some big investment news, and you started your company, Essential Accessibility, 13 years ago. You've seen quite an evolution in accessibility, as well as and how an industry response has changed to it. I recall when you started your company, you were really focused on ensuring that marketers understood the size and the spending power of the disability market. Now it appears that your mission is more about inclusivity, digital usability, and new legal standards. Could you just talk about that for a minute, just to open up the discussion?
Sure, and thanks for having me, and I'm sure everyone else on the show. Yes, your question about approaching the marketers, that was about driving the agenda. It was the fact that we're all aware to a certain extent that people with disabilities have certain needs and that are not being addressed. But the problem was that was always being dealt with at the lowest rung in the ladder in the organization. And when you're at that level, you're just not commanding the attention, budget, and resources that are necessary to put it front and center on the agenda. So by approaching the marketers and appealing to marketers on the business case, the opportunity here, marketers also have very sizable budgets. You had people there that were the movers and shakers in the organization that could upend that and drive it and make it front and center. And now, fast forward, we're still talking to marketers. We're still educating marketers. The work is not done there, but at least from the standpoint of building that level of awareness into the necessity of factoring this into certain design elements, certain technological pieces in the organization, that has been enacted through different strands of legislations and regulations. And again, the work is continuing to be done there. So what we're seeing is a convergence. There's now a little bit of a requirement out there in the marketplace to do this because you must, but we try to remind everyone you must because there's a good reason to do this that wasn't patently obvious just from reading the technical specifications. So we're inspiring. We're making marketers realize 1 in 5 self-identify as having a disability. Of course, not everyone with a disability has trouble getting online. We're very clear to point that out. But if you want to be a disability-friendly brand, project that image, resonate not just with that 1 in 5, but with the friends and family members, people with disabilities, and establish an emotional connection with them, everyone with an emotional connection to disability, then it's important that no one be left behind. That's the message.
Well, I think that certainly messages of inclusion are resonating more now than ever before, but you talked about a fair amount about compliance. And I would just like to ask Evie, as well as Karen, given the work that you're doing in the legal field, if you've seen a rise in the number of web accessibility demand letters, for example, or of greater compliance.
Sure. So I'm happy to start there. So basically we help brands determine their obligations under accessibility legislation in Canada. Most provinces have them and they're at different stages. Some mostly focus on public sector, some are at different stages where they're developing standards yet haven't really gone all the way, but really right now where I'm seeing the focus is on Ontario. By far, it's the province that has the most advanced accessibility legislation in Canada, and mostly because all of the standards kind of are in force right now. The website being the last one to come into play. It came in on January 1st, 2021. So all websites, if you're in organizations with 50 or more employees in Ontario, you have to have an accessible website. So we're fairly early here in the compliance state. So we haven't been seeing a lot of demand letters yet, mostly because the Ontario regulator is cognizant of the fact that a lot of, it just happened. So they're mostly focused on teaching, monitoring, that type of stuff. And a lot of businesses, because of the pandemic, had to kind of shift pretty quickly to a digital presence. So they may not have done everything with accessibility in mind, right? So they're not really looking to punish them or go right away with demand letters. It's mostly like what I'll call information letters or corrections, and giving them time to really kind of understand, get what they need to know to make an accessible website. So that's where I've kind of been seeing the focus, mostly in Ontario. A lot of people are having questions of, does it apply to me? Number one, what do I need to do? Where do I start? Things like that. So that's where I've been seeing it in Canada.
Now, Karen, you're in New York, so I'm wondering if you're dealing with all of the US and if the situation is quite different from Canada.
Sure. So in the past month, I've dealt with complaints coming from Florida, coming from California, coming from Pennsylvania, coming from New York, and it's a very different picture in the United States than what Evie just painted in Canada. It's extremely litigious. I have clients who have not only received one demand letter, some of them have received 10 demand letters. Some of them have been sued 10 different times in different states all over the country. And we did not see any sort of slowdown. If anything, we saw an increase during COVID. So this is very much on the rise, both with respect to websites as well as to mobile apps as well. And this is certainly something that all of our clients are extremely concerned about, both when they receive these letters, and also we're seeing many more clients become more proactive. What can we do to ensure that we won't be the target of one of these lawsuits? And I want to also say, it's not just about avoiding litigation. This is very personal to me. My father was blind, my grandmother was blind. We see a lot of companies understanding how important inclusion is, and how, I think this is what Simon said, it's not just to avoid litigation, but it's to ensure that all people who visit your website are able to access the information and participate.
No, you're absolutely right, and I'm not surprised that the U.S. might be a little bit more litigious than Canada, but I'd like to turn it over just for a minute to Lucy, because her work is a little bit different. It is in the, shall we say, the real world of disability issues, as opposed to the online world. But one of the things that intrigues me about it is that, and Simon has talked to this point a number of times, but one of the things that is quite interesting is that I think we've seen, obviously, how the real world has informed the online world. But I think through COVID, we might be seeing a little bit of it happening the other way as well. With our move to digital might actually make some change in the real world. But Lucy, tell us a little bit about your expertise and also a little bit about what you're seeing.
Sure. Hi, Deborah. So I work as a lawyer in London, but focusing on employment labour law issues. And so I suppose it's real world in the sense that I'm looking at what employers have to do to make provision for their employees. I'm also disabled, so I use a wheelchair, so I don't have any problems accessing websites. So that's a relatively new world for me. But I think what I've noticed in the last year and a half is how, in many respects, for many people, being able to do things online. So for me, not having to travel, not having to try and find my way through, public transport or into buildings, it's all been a bit of a leveler. So I can now access things in a much easier way by doing everything online. So then when you think about how that is so important for people who can't access things online, we're opening up in one regard and making things much more inclusive, but then there can be this huge barrier for people who can't access the online world in a way that they should be able to. So it's been a really interesting experience for me, because now I am effectively with a hidden disability, because now nobody can see it. And so that's been very, very interesting. From a UK point of view, in terms of what employers have to do, a lot of it is about what's reasonable, and what's reasonable in terms of their organisation, and that's judged by reference to the size of their organisation and their budgets and that kind of thing. But we do see situations where employees will need adjustments made in their workplace, and I think that will be the case going forward as people are looking to find their way in this new environment.
No, you're absolutely right, and I think that if there's anything that good has happened is that it's, as you said, the leveling the playing field a bit for some people, and also creating greater interest, or at least greater concern on the part of employers, whether it's through their ESG concerns or whatever it might be. Let me just ask, I'll throw this out to anyone, and then I'm going to specifically ask Sebastian, given that he's done an index on it, but are certain industry sectors more, I'm not sure if I should say at risk or vulnerable, but are more susceptible to some of these issues than others, or is it widespread across all industries?
I think we've seen, I guess, taking from the US perspective, since we seem to be seeing much more of the litigation than maybe some other countries, is the retail sector, I think, has been hit particularly hard. And I think that's because their point of sale and barriers to purchasing things online. I think there's been some pushback in certain other industries and sectors where it hasn't been as successful, but I think restaurants and retailers are where we've seen the vast majority of the litigation.
That's interesting, because Simon, I remember when you were explaining the evolution of your company to me at one point, you were saying that there were some landmark issues. I recall, just at the top of my head, Target. Was Target one of them? And it started in the physical world with the need to build ramps and so on. Want to talk about that?
Landmark case, yeah, the landmark case was the big, from a sizable amount standpoint, was Target, something like 13 maybe years ago. And yeah, accessibility applies to every sector, so no one's immune to it. But I haven't done a study on it, but yeah, when you look at the docket of what comes through, there does seem to be a lot of small businesses. But when you think about it, there are millions of small businesses, or I don't know if there's millions, hundreds of thousands at least in America. So how many major cement manufacturers are there? And so I think, the gravitational pull of retail is going to be one thing. It also, it speaks to the legitimacy of a certain number of the complaints, that it really is a person frustrated. Of course, not all these claims are legitimate, but so that's going to be overweighted towards retail, I would suspect. And it's across the board. I mean, this lawsuit's going on in education, in all kinds of domains. The landmark case in Canada, it was government. It was a blind lady sued the federal government. So you see it a lot. But again, in terms of the volume, you've got firms that are doing this from a secondary gain perspective, that are turning this into a machine gun business. And so they don't have the most altruistic of intentions, and they're just spraying and praying, in a manner of speaking. But going back to your thing, yeah, it started with Target. That was big news, of course, to the disability community. But a $6 million lawsuit to the likes of a Walmart is like a big yawn, if you ask me. I mean, Walmart, last I checked, had something like 800 lawyers in-house, and we're dealing with a slip and fall claim every 2 minutes. So these guys are used to paying out, settling massive amounts. So I guess the kind of unfortunate thing in that respect is, what legal impact does that really have? I think it's reputational impact. I think a company like Target looked at this and said, do we want this stigma associated when 1 in 5 of our potential customers is part of this, and their friends and their family members? I think that would have been the bigger driving force. I don't think a $6 million fine makes a multi-billion dollar retailer necessarily take things uber seriously.
Well, you raise a good point, because reputation also matters, and reputation also factors into everything from brand value to, customer trust and everything else. Let me just segue for a moment to Sebastian, because you've done some amazing work here with your Global Corporate Website Index, where you actually look at major corporations, mostly in the Fortune 1000 around the world, but you've isolated 320 odd different industry segments to look at whether their corporate websites really are viable in a number of ways. Do you want to talk to us a little bit more about that, and why you created it, how it measures things, and maybe even comment on some of these industry sectors that we're talking about? I'm not sure if you've got at your fingertips everything on retail, but I'm sure you can add and move the conversation along given the way you think strategically.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for this opportunity. Well, taking a step back, so why is this important? I think, Simon, you definitely phrased it. I think COVID has, and Lucy, you were definitely saying that as well. But we don't go online any longer, we live online. An average person in the US, they spend 7 to 8.5 hours connected every day. So talking about that we are going online makes absolutely no sense. And that's why this is extremely important, simply because that we're doing more of our shopping, more of our banking, more of our research, more of our dating, more of our communication, and more of our business online. To the extent that it's difficult to imagine our lives as we're living it today without an access, without, of course, the support of technology companies making this happen. And of course, living our best possible life should be accessible for everyone. So that's why I think this is damn important. I think that's why the last 18 months has moved the needle significantly in terms of corporations and brands' understanding of why this is so important. One thing is, of course, the ability to sell, but we are so entangled with many of these companies now that they have not only a legal obligation, but also a moral one in terms of their customers. So I think that's taking a step back. And we were talking a little bit about different industries. We do a lot of work with healthcare companies. And of course, yes, retail companies are certainly important in order to conduct transactions. But you think about disability, and you think about, let's call it that, especially the last 18 months where access to the healthcare system has been more difficult. We have then found our information online. So what we see is a significant uptick from healthcare companies in order to make sure that their customers, which is usually the payers, but also the patients, and all of the caretakers, that could be family and of course nurses, etc. They have access to information at their fingertips, regardless of you have a disability or not. So I think that first of all, of course, healthcare companies, they should be in the forefront on especially this particular area. They have to. Yes, of course, it is it is very, very difficult from a technology perspective just to flip a switch and then everything is done. We heard about Canada. They have, of course, certain sets of regulations and obligations, and it's different in the US and it's different in Europe, and of course to Asia it's another thing. Nevertheless, what I sense is a curiosity, in terms of what is this, how do we create a better digital environment for all of our different stakeholders. And I do think that I think, to Simon's point, that is how, and if the end point here is that we have an opportunity for everyone to live their best possible life, and by doing so, of course, have access to their digital different digital touch points, then that is what will move the needle significantly. That is, of course, the reputational area of this. Beyond that, I think it's great business. 1 in 5, that's a lot of that's a lot of money. Of course, and a lot of reputational risk. But that is, to me, how we are moving the needle. So the world, I think, is more ready now than they were 2 years ago. And if you look in terms of the corporate website index that we have created in the different industries, What we're seeing is especially B2B companies traditionally has been investing quite significantly in their websites. They have long buying cycles. There was a obvious business case in doing so. Retail, of course, are starting to invest significantly. They are still battling a little bit in terms of the physical assets versus the digital assets, and how do they do that in terms of cannibalization, etc. I think that they are starting to get the business models in place. The area in terms of where we should and have to see more investments is more in the entertainment area. And traditionally, they have been okay in terms of bringing their assets online, but as more and more of that are becoming more interactive, I would say that that's where they are struggling in terms of accessibility and making sure that they have inclusion for all different stakeholders. Last, in terms of PCT brands, they're doing in general a horrible job in terms of their digital presence. And of course, in terms of people with disability, I would guess that that's where they are losing out.
So that would be direct to consumer brands. So through e-commerce largely, or?
I would say less with e-commerce, because that's usually there is a business case in doing so. But if you think about the PCT, the big PCT brands, Unilever, Kraft, Coke, etc., these different they have in general been struggling in order to create a strategic foundation in terms of their digital presence. And I would say especially for people with disability, they have not done a great job.
Thank you for that, Sebastian. I think that crystallizes a lot of the why that we've been talking about in the beginning. Maybe what we can do now is segue to the how. And interestingly, I may start with the lawyers first, because, you know, what do you suggest to your clients in terms of how they can be better accessible, or how they can avoid some of these suits, or what they should do?
So I think there are some great free online sort of like open source tools that can do what I call a quick and dirty scan of your website. And the reason I say it is it's not perfect. It doesn't scan for all the different factors in WCAG, which is the gold standard for what it means, at least in the United States, to be compliant with the federal and state disability laws. But I think it can be really eye-opening and free for a company. There's one that is put out by Wave. There's one that's put out by DQ, the AXE tool. There are a bunch out there. And I think it can give companies a pretty quick sense of how their website compares to the WCAG standards. And I think once a company looks and says on the first page, I have 100 red flags, I think that can be really eye-opening. And the reason that's a good tool as well is a lot of plaintiffs' lawyers in the United States use, for instance, Wave to identify websites that are problematic and then send a demand letter or file a lawsuit. So I think that's a first level. And then I think it really depends on the sophistication of the business and the sophistication of their in-house IT department, whether they do things in-house or whether they have an outside web developer. I mean, websites are living, breathing things that are constantly changing. And even if you're okay today, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're okay tomorrow, unless you have the expertise who's ever coding the website and adding to it, that they're constantly thinking about WCAG and about accessibility issues. So I think that's the first thing I often do with clients, and we do it together on the screen so they can see what I'm seeing and noting that it's not, you know, the best scan possible, but it gives you a good idea. And then I think you have to speak with the company about what their capabilities are to address these issues in-house, or whether they need to engage a third party to either provide a blueprint map for them of this is what you need to do to implement, or whether they really need to engage a third party to actually do the remediation of the website and set up some sort of ongoing compliance auditing program to ensure that they're keeping track going forward. And it's not just something you do on day one and then you're fine going forward, but it needs to be an ongoing concern for the company.
Thanks. That I think is a good starting point. Evie, do you find the same thing in Canada, or?
Yeah, so I would echo a lot of Karen's points there. There are 1,000 resources available for companies to kind of, we call the accessibility checker of their website. One of them is posted by the Ontario government. So that's the first step, is always run your website through that just to issue spot and see what the red flags are and where you identify any gaps in the area, things that you need to prioritize and how to correct those gaps. And then like Karen was saying, working with a web developer that's kind of an expert in accessibility. There are a lot of web developers, but trying to find one that is an expert in accessibility is important as well, to help you design your website, or help you if you can't correct those issues yourself. And then another thing I always say is, let's say like you can't, for instance, there's a part of your website that you can't meet the accessibility, or you can't make sure that it's compliant with the guidelines, making sure that you have another format available. So maybe in print, or making sure that there's a resource for people where they can get a different format, or a print format, or whatever that may be, or having kind of an area where you can receive feedback, hear complaints. I think that's very important for people, knowing that they have a place where they can have their concerns heard and that the company is acting on them at their, like, that's step one. That as a company, I am here to receive your complaints and I am acting on them or working on them. I think that's also important from a reputational perspective as well.
Lucy, I don't want to put you on the spot because I know your business is a little bit different, but Evie just said something that echoed in my mind. I'm wondering if in the future we're going to see more companies merging, or at least looking at their online and offline presence through the same lens. I'm not sure we're seeing that right now, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we are. Any comment?
Yeah, I think possibly that's right, Deborah. I certainly, hope so. I think what we see certainly in the UK is that there is definitely a growing interest in disability awareness, and certainly in the work that I do, a lot of my work involves training as well. So training people in different areas of employment law. And it's something that we have to be mindful of as well. As we deliver everything online now, we have to be mindful of our audience and thinking, who does this need to reach and how do we need to adapt our content? Because although it's much more accessible, if you have a physical disability and it means you don't have to travel and it's easier to access online, it's not easier for everybody. So you have to, I think, keep the lines of communication open. And I think that's probably the key, actually, is getting the information to Karen and Evie's point, is actually getting the guidance that you need, because there's so many different needs, I think, that we can't possibly all be expert in all of them.
No, you're right. You're right. And I think pretending that you are, it might be mistake number one. But Simon, one of the things that I find interesting, and I'm not trying to overemphasize this, but one of the things that's of interest, given your recent investment from KKR, is that they actually are really looking to make a stand on this issue of inclusivity on all levels, but particularly inclusivity for people with disabilities, because it is such a large sector, as we mentioned. And I think that if I understand it correctly, they really do want to encourage all of the companies that they work with or invest in and so on to become compliant, which would be a major game changer, given that I think they work with 1,000 companies in some way, shape, or form, and to start pushing in that direction could mean big changes in the industry. Now, you might want to comment on that, because one of the things that you do as a company is go well beyond the basics in terms of providing accessibility. So if you'd like to add something to that, I'd love to hear it.
Sure, yeah, you correctly observed that. I mean, accessibility has arrived. Now is our time. It's basically, it's been validated, you know, the pushback, you know, putting aside the Domino's Supreme Court case, which was a bizarre thing to fight from a brand reputation standpoint. There's just, the vast majority of organizations are accepting of the fact that this needs to be done. You know, where they are on the path is what's varying, and things need to move faster, but the direction of progress is heading in the right way. One thing I want to do a little bit as well is just kind of disabuse people. I mean, you pointed out, we've talked about using checkers and things like that to flag the fact that your website, to determine, do you have a problem? I mean, it's virtually a guarantee. If you don't have some team that owns accessibility, or your agency has attested to that they put the resources in it and have validated it, like, your site is going to be inaccessible. It doesn't happen by divine intervention. It's still good. It's still enlightening to check it. But, you know, some people just kind of go into this thinking, yeah, I wonder if we're accessible or not. You're not, unless somebody owns it. There's no way it's happened, number one. The second one is this kind of belief that you can get a person that's going to like solve the problem for you. And that's a legacy mindset, like, of getting a consultant. And the consultant is this omniscient individual that's just going to wave their wand behind closed doors and poof, your problem solved. It's not how it works. I mean, we didn't have to pursue investment on Wall Street because it was so easy that we could just get a person to bless the website and the problem solved. It's complicated. I mean, if you're building a website for a bowling alley with a 6-line message, I mean, yeah, in that situation. But the modern website, think of the original website, you had one webmaster. Now you've got digital teams. It's the same analogy for accessibility. Accessibility, it's very complex. You got a lot of different specialists that are testing to varying degrees, and it's a process. And it's not a one-time thing. It's not a punctuated thing. It's ongoing. It's being built into the development life cycle. I mean, we're now seeing this continuous, I'm not going to get technical, but continuous integration on an ongoing development basis, because your assets are continually changing. By virtue of the fact that the technologies they interact with are changing, and the content is continually being refreshed. And the complexity we're seeing in the organization is we've gone from the one website static town scenario to dynamic portfolios of assets. And how do you manage all these different assets? Learning management systems, you know, digital wallets. Like, so there's all this complexity. You know, Sebastian pointed out entertainment. Oh boy, you get into gaming, you get into all these interactive elements where the experience necessitates. So yeah, we're trying to catch up to all this stuff, and the technology keeps driving things and making it even more complex. So this is not a simple thing where you just get a person. Of course, getting a person is going to get you closer to the finish line. So I'm not discouraging you either from that. Expertise is invaluable, but it's not so simple as just get a person. I mean, large regulated organizations like the telcos have 30 people on staff. Some have PhDs, and they have to engage vendors to do these, whether for productivity tools or et cetera. So,
yeah, Simon, just one more thing before I move back to Sebastian on a particular point. You once told me, when I was trying to understand this more, and I think it might be interesting in light of what Karen mentioned about her concerns, you know, with some blindness in her family. You once mentioned to me how some sites will try to adapt for the blind, but they don't realize that they've made it worse for them. Can you just give that quick example? Because I think it adds to, it showcases how complex this can be, but I don't want people to be daunted that it can't be done.
Yeah, there's another pandemic going on that's afflicting corporations. And what it's doing is it's hoodwinking unsuspecting, unwitting corporations into thinking that you can get a magic solution that involves a one line of code on your website. These are called overlay technologies, and they're very seductive. Who wouldn't want to solve all the world's problems in 1 second for, you know, a $50 bill? The problem is they don't work, and there's just, without getting into the technical reasons why, it's just like you can't cure cancer with a magic pill. There's no easy way to do this, and there's certainly no cheap turnkey way to do it. And so it's important to recognize that when any organization does their homework, they come to this conclusion very quickly. But for the uninitiated, the first question is, well, why don't we just do that? why don't we just take this easy path? Why go the hard way? And what I would say is, do you think Domino's went all the way to the Supreme Court, fought that for years, spent who knows how many sums fighting that case, brand reputation to lose? If for $50 they could have just slapped a banana sticker on their website and it would have solved the problem. So there you go there.
Go ahead, Karen. Go ahead.
And I was just going to point out, to highlight Simon's point, there have been companies, and I'm thinking of one company in particular, that used one of these overlays and was still sued for not being compliant with the ADA and related state laws. And we're seeing more and more of that. And I think that's how I'm having the most productive conversations with my clients about this, that it isn't sort of this magic button that you press and set it and forget it, and then your website's compliant.
Deb, you had asked a point. I didn't answer one part of your question. It's not only is it ineffective. Once upon a time, you dealt with two scenarios. The vast majority of organizations were just heel dragging and not addressing accessibility. And then you had the early adopters that were moving in this direction. Now you've got this third element in the last little while where they're going this third way of the banana sticker that, hey, look, I'm solving the problem. And so it's actually, we used to say that perfection is the enemy of the good, like in the sense that we would always encourage companies, don't avoid doing things. Companies would say, I don't want to do something, it's not perfect. Something is always better than nothing. We've been preaching that from day one. But now when you get into this overlay technology, something is actually worse than nothing because it actually is breaking the experience in many cases for these individuals. And there's lots of, if you Google around, you'll hear anecdotal information. The National Federation of the Blind, the biggest organization representing blind people, has just banned one of these providers and just said, like, it's just sending a message. This is, forget that it's useless. Like if you want to sell a vitamin and say it cures cancer, like whatever, buyer beware. But this is actually, in a sense, the causing problems for many people. And it's sending a message, don't fix your website the proper way. That is regressive. And it's making the world a more difficult place for people with disabilities. It's actually quite horrific. To knowingly be doing that, it's like selling a fake vaccine, to someone. Not only are you scamming them, you're making them walk around exposed. Like it's
I love the passion on this topic, and rightly so. What, particularly when you talk about how many friends and family are involved, and just sometimes the outrage on some of these issues. I did want to cycle back to Sebastian, if I could, for just a minute, because you've really, in your thinking about websites, you've really moved from obviously any kind of a static website to really thinking about them as more experience operations or experience platforms for brands. And I know that that's very sophisticated because it involves all sorts of artificial intelligence to help the flow of content and so on and so forth. But do you want to just jump in here? Because I think what we're also trying to get at is a little bit of maybe some of the easiest ways to help marketers.
Yeah, no, I think the main thing here is that we hear a lot about personalization. And of course, what that means is that you are creating a relevant experience for a very small segment, sometimes the segment of one. And of course, if you think about disability here, then if companies are moving down this path, they of course are obligated to think about people with disability. Otherwise, they're simply not doing personalization. So I think that the interesting bit here is that companies are starting to think about much smaller segments that can be there, or that should be served in a very different way. So they're starting to get the mindset. I simply just don't think that a lot of brands and corporations are thinking about people with disability as segments and how to treat them. But the technology are certainly coming in place. We see a bigger desire and interest, And I think that starting to create relevant experiences, leveraging technology also for people with disability, is simply becoming more of a natural discussions when we are formulating and drafting these different websites. So that's the good thing. The interesting bit here is simply that I do think that there is a lack of knowledge and understanding of what is a relevant experience for different people with different kinds of disability. What is it? And in that sense, I think, and it certainly might be available out there, and then sorry for my ignorance, but I do think creating a greater understanding of what would it be to have what is a great experience for different kinds of individuals with different disabilities would help, of course, companies like the ones that I represent, but also a lot of different brands in crafting these different experiences. Because coming back to one thing is to be compliant. I think that normally when we speak to companies about digital experiences, it's not about being compliant. Of course, they need to be that, but a lot of companies goes way beyond being compliant in many different areas. Usually, of course, that's what makes a brand, is that they're not just compliant with a certain legal aspect, but they go way beyond that. And I do think that some brands, there is a massive opportunity here to actually do a lot more than meeting the bar. I completely understand that we need to get the entire industry and the entire world up to meeting that bar. But it's also about, I think, for brands to understand the opportunity, not only to meet the bar, but to go way beyond. And I'm starting to see a lot of how technology actually can go in and hand in hand. And I think, Simon, your company is obviously a great example of that. But also technologies like Alexa, the Google Assistant, etc., where you can actually start to have a meaningful conversation, and Alexa can do stuff for you regardless of you having a disability or not. Accessing websites, do some of your shopping, informing your family members that about certain things, etc. So I see certainly a significant investment in building out these different assistants that is not only coming from the big technology companies, but also other companies are starting to leverage them to a greater extent.
No, that's interesting that life is becoming so complicated that we all need assistance in many other ways. This conversation has been absolutely fascinating, and I hope that we're shedding light on a lot of different aspects of it. Let me just ask each of you as we come to a close, what you see, just in very shortly, what do you see ahead for disability inclusion, for the business of marketing, for the functionality of websites, for legal issues? I mean, I know this is a sweeping question, but I'd really be curious as to what each of you see is ahead, and then perhaps we can continue this conversation a little bit down the road and see if we are seeing progress in some of those areas. So who would like to start on that one? Go ahead, Simon.
I'd like to remind people what the progress, to see where we're going. I want you to see what we've arrived to. Too often we're oblivious to what's been accomplished. When I find that when you talk about accessibility or disability to people, suddenly they start noticing it more. And but they also notice it in the wrong ways, in the sense that the stereotypes of a blind person with a white cane, or someone who uses and all those types of assistive devices really are a small subset of the entire disability community. What I want to really convey is that, look at portrayals, for example. We've seen award-winning commercials, we've seen movies, we're seeing disability just being more pervasive in society, being embraced. We're seeing statements of attestation around inclusion. We're seeing the ESG movement. So I think you're going to start seeing disability, which is kind of getting a bit of short shrift, relatively speaking, within the ESG framework, I think it's going to gain a lot more prominence. And that's just because it's historically disability didn't get as much attention within the diversity attention span as other segments. So I think you're going to start seeing more weighting being ascribed to it in these frameworks that corporations are propounding. And that's going to come to expression in all these ways, like just experiences and portrayals.
No, that, and I think it is good to always look back to see how far we've come, because some people don't always remember. Any Evie, Karen, and Lucy, any other thoughts?
So I agree with Simon. I think that there's really a rallying cry right now around inclusion. And I think this, I mean, in the United States, I can speak for, the one thing that these litigations have accomplished is bringing this to the forefront of people's minds and helping companies not only understand the litigation risk of not having a compliant digital presence, but also the loss of customers, the wide range of abilities that their client base has. One thing I think we will maybe see in the future is more of a focus on accessibility in social media. I think that's one place where I've really seen it lag behind, places where there's user-generated content and these platforms having automated captions, which are really not great. So I think that's one place that hasn't really been spotlighted so much that we might see greater attention paid to in the future.
No, I think you're right. Go ahead.
No, sorry, Simon. Just going to echo, obviously, I think everyone's been mentioning one in five Canadians suffer from disability. We're dealing with an aging population. So obviously accessibility is going to be more and more of a consideration for a lot of people when they interact with brands. So it's something that a lot of companies are just going to have to think about sooner rather than later, one from a brand perspective and then from a legislative perspective. Ontario and the federal government are at the forefront right now, but it's very clear that all the provinces want to move forward to making accessibility like apply to private organizations. Maybe not right now, but down the line, that's where we want to go. And so it's important to keep that in mind that yes, right now, maybe we're not seeing a lot of demand letters in Canada, but I mean, at some point we're going to get an enforcement complaint, and $100,000 per day violation is something to think about, definitely. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, you're right. Go ahead, Simon. Did you want to? I know you want to jump in.
I just wanted to add, just one more point. Just an audience of marketers and people with a marketing bent that are listening to this. It's the fact that when you look at the latest rankings that Return on Disability Index did, where they score the companies on who's doing a good job. Apple, Google, and Disney, continuously come up on top. So also they'll be looking at the bellwethers, like who's setting the good example here. Pay special attention to the stuff that Disney does and to what Google's doing. And you're seeing their ads now and what Apple's doing. And that'll give you an idea too, where the future's going as organizations follow some of these practices. So that puts it in more of a observable.
No, good point. Good point. Lucy, would you like to add something on this? Because again, I know that you're learning quite a bit, but I think you've got a lot to offer in terms of the real world, as I keep saying. Yeah.
I think for me, a lot of it is about visibility, because with greater visibility means you break down the stereotypes. And so often what I see is that disabled people are put into a little box, without any thought about how many different disabilities there are and different need sets. And if I could tell you how many times I've been asked, just because I use a wheelchair, am I a Paralympian or am I about to do the marathon? And I'm like, oh, I'm just a lawyer. I'm sorry. It's
just that's pretty good. Yeah.
That idea that we have to be either we're on one end of the spectrum of in terms of maybe we are being cared for, or it's the other end where you're some kind of superhuman. And I think what we need is greater visibility around, the 1 in 5 is a big number. There are a lot of people out there with different disabilities, and we need a greater awareness of that. And that, I think, is what will start to shift, the products and things being developed in a better way.
No, you're right. And let's only hope so. Well, that means, Sebastian, you're going to get the final word.
Now, I think a lot of great stuff has already been said, but I want to go back to in terms of that we are not only going online, we are living online. And I think this whole thing could once for all democratize the participation, regardless of who you are, if you're disabled, not disabled, in terms of where you are. We are all seeing it, right? Our own offices, we are working remotely and distributed. And that, to me, is providing such an amazing opportunity for mankind, the world, to provide access and allow for participation. We now just need the brands, and I certainly see the willingness to understand the opportunity here.
You know, opportunity is a wonderful word when it's associated with this topic. And I genuinely hope that some of the things that we've talked about will keep accelerating, keep coming to pass. And I hope that we keep talking about it, because I'm sure that as we delve a little bit deeper, this group has a lot of other topics they might want to bring up or comment on that will be to the benefit of marketers, brands, employers. And this is important. And I can't thank you enough for what you've shared today. So again, a big thanks, and looking forward to talking to everyone again. Maybe this can be a series of solutions.
Thank you, Deb. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you.
All right. Good. Take care now. Bye-bye now.